everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nicole van der Meulen. I'm Cybersecurity Innovation Lead at SURF. I assume some of you were in the presentation before me, where SURF was briefly introduced, but for those of you who weren't here, SURF is the ICT cooperation for universities, applied universities, and vocational schools. I'm happy to elaborate on what SURF does later on. It's not in the presentation, but what I'm doing in the presentation is part of my position at SURF. I mostly look at technological evolution and the impact of it on cybersecurity. But for this presentation, I want to go back all the way to the start of my career, which was in 2006, when I arrived at Tilburg University to do a PhD project on digital identity fraud. At the time, I ventured to say no one in the Netherlands was working on this topic. And the question was really from my PhD supervisors, there is going to be a new type of victim because of digital identity fraud, and what are we going to do about it? And I really tried to look at what we call within criminology at the opportunity structure. The thing is, I started speaking to many people and I said, okay, this is going to be a problem. And most people said, no, this is not going to be a problem in the Netherlands. It isn't a problem. So I became quite, I would have to say, disillusioned. But there I was, very young, a little naive, and I didn't want to give up yet, because for anyone who's done a PhD project, it's a bit like an antibiotics course. Once you start, you have to finish, even if you don't see any results while you're working at it. But then this man appeared in 2008. I'm not sure if he looks familiar to you, so just in case, this is Ron Causolea, and he was the first public victim of identity fraud in the Netherlands. It wasn't digital identity fraud, but at least there was a face to victimhood when it came to identity fraud in the Netherlands. The National Ombudsman gave a lot of attention to his case, because what had happened is someone had taken his identity, abused it while committing criminal acts. So Ron was in all systems as a criminal. He was arrested, he was held hostage at Schiphol. So many things happened to him. And the main thing, and the reason why I mention him, is that he said, but I didn't do it. And the police and other law enforcement agencies thought, well, that's what every criminal says. Yes. But the thing with victims of identity fraud is they also say it, but of course they don't have the ability to prove it wasn't them. Because there is this assumption of authenticity. Whatever is in the system, and he was in the system as a criminal, is never wrong. So once it has been entered, there is this assumption that it's authentic, that it's real, and that it is correct. And that is a fundamental problem. Because I think we've come to a stage where we know there's no such thing as absolute security, but there's also no thing as absolute authenticity. And that was important in 2006. But I venture to say it's far more important now because of AI and because of the ability to generate deepfakes, voice clones, etc. So I'm going to fast forward, finish the PhD to 2020. At the time, I was working for Europol, the European Cybercrime Center, on the IOCTA. So again, a nice continuation, I would say, from the previous presentation. This was a very strategic threat assessment we did on an annual basis. And every year, the communications department would come to me and would say, what's the new threat this year? And I would say, well, ransomware is still the most dominant threat. And the communications department would say, no, we can't come out with the same thing. But I said, well, that is reality. But what they wanted was, they wanted something flashy, because we're constantly saying that cybercrime changes very fast. Yes. At an operational level, it does. But at a strategic level, it really doesn't change that much. We face many of the same threats. Of course, there are changes. And in 2020 specifically, I would say this really came to the center, because I spoke to all the law enforcement agencies remotely. I interviewed them. And it was the first time we did interviews as opposed to surveys. And they said, well, there hasn't changed that much, really. So the theme also became cybercrime is an evolution rather than a revolution. And I had to come to the conclusion, based on my experience, that there is no such thing as a new threat. And I really still stand behind that. I think if we go back to sort of the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, I think you can capture any existing threats within this framework. And what I think is most important is obviously the issue of access in general, but especially unauthorized access. And this, to me, connects to sort of the broader problem of impersonation scams, identity fraud, and anything we're dealing with today. So, does change happen? Absolutely. Criminals adapt when necessary. As long as something is working, there is no need to change. This sounds logical, but I think we don't think about this enough. So whenever there is an emerging technology, there is this immediate response of, oh, why aren't they using it yet? They will, but they might not need it in the moment. It might not have been tested enough. Because indeed, they adapt when an opportunity arises, but it has to really improve what they're already doing, otherwise why bother? And it shouldn't cost too much effort. I think what we sometimes forget is criminals are humans too. So ultimately, if we think it's convenient, they probably will too. But most importantly is that they do not disobey their roots. And this goes back to sort of what I showed a couple of slides before with the CIA triad. But it's also important in terms of understanding sort of the underlying threat base to anticipate how they're going to abuse emerging technologies. And I don't think we do this enough. So what I see happening is something emerges as not necessarily a new threat type, but at least as a rejuvenated threat, I shall say, by incorporating some emerging technology. And then people seem to be surprised. And we love to call everything sophisticated. I'm guilty. I may have mentioned sophisticated at least once in this presentation. But in general, we have this tendency to say something is new, sophisticated, and we're caught off guard. But if we understand the underlying level, we shouldn't be caught off guard. And we should, in fact, be able to anticipate it. So how does generative AI actually challenge this perspective, if it challenges it at all? Well, I would say we get into the situation of it expands and exacerbates what was already possible to a large extent. So we already witnessed, I would say, at least a decade, if not 15 years, of cybercrime as a service. And the reason why cybercrime as a service is relevant is because it made committing actual cybercrime very accessible. It allowed criminals to specialize, very low threshold for entry, so everybody could engage, so it enhanced the scale. We could rent everything, we could rent people, we could buy tools, etc. AI is like a multiplier of that, clearly. It's very fast, it makes it far more accessible, etc. But it also, so in general, I would say it makes things easier and more efficient, but it does introduce new dimensions. And the specific dimensions I'm interested in is the ability to sort of copy identities, generate synthetic identities, really introduce a new component. So if we look at forms of authentication, obviously we have something you know, something you have, and something you are. Most of the focus throughout my research has always been on something you know and something you have. Obviously, with all the data breaches happening, personal information, username and passwords leaking are very attractive. If you have single-factor authentication, well, you're probably a fool, but on top of that, it's also, very accessible. Something you have also garnered a lot of attention with man-in-the-middle attacks, etc. But something you are was always, I would say, mostly out of the picture because the tools weren't really there to imitate it as well. So I don't think criminals were really even investing in it. So we took it, I would say, as a pretty solid form of authentication. With Gen AI, that has clearly changed. So in a way, I would say that is a fundamental change with the ability to generate deepfakes, synthetic identities, and voice cloning, something we are, has become vulnerable. Now, I don't know how many of you remember this television show or if you've ever seen it. But Catfish, for those of you who don't know, was about people who were online dating. And they were speaking to someone, and they had become suspicious that this other person, their love interest, wasn't really who they said they were. So they would call these two guys, and these two guys would go in search of this love interest. And most of the time, it was someone else. It wasn't the person in the picture. It wasn't a person they had sort of described. But the reason the, I shall say, victim or the person who asked these guys to step in even contacted them was because the love interest was never willing to appear in front of the camera. So they were unable to do a video call, and many times they were unable to even call them. So this was what allowed them to give them a bit of a red flag. But this is gone now. And I think it's really a game changer. And it's not about the show, but it's more about the fact that we don't have this element we can sort of intuitively trust anymore, I would say. Now, there is quite a wide spectrum. So I understand it stays very high level because with the tools we have available now, we already had different forms of impersonation fraud. So not everything is about identity fraud. First of all, because not everything is about copying an existing identity. It can be an existing identity of a general person, it can be a politician, it can be a celebrity, it can be a specific employee. But obviously, we can also just generate an identity pretending to be someone else. So it very much depends on who are you targeting, who are you trying to be, and who are you trying to get out of. And then there's obviously the distinction, are you trying to be a person, or are you trying to pretend to be someone from an organization towards someone else? It's just to show the breadth of diversity. The main difference is, are you the target or are you part of the attack? And obviously, if you're part of the attack, then it is your identity being abused to mislead someone else. But the main thing is, either way, you're a victim, but the implications of your victimization are different. If I fall victim to a romance scam or pig butchering scam, I don't want to marginalize it. It's very bad. You lose money, you lose trust. But if someone abuses my identity, first of all, I will discover it much later, and it might also have implications for other areas of my life, depending on how it has been abused. And you are stuck with this reverse burden of proof, that you don't really have the ability to say, this wasn't me, or you don't have the evidence to back it up. Now, in terms of the size of the problem, it's difficult to find reliable statistics, but it is emerging in a sense. I took this from the Federal Trade Commission. What is interesting about this is it focuses on the elderly. And I think ultimately everyone is vulnerable. The elderly are a specific category in the sense that obviously they haven't grown up with the technological capabilities. They might not be as aware as other people of what is really feasible now. So I think they are potentially even more vulnerable. In terms of, this is from the UK, just showing some of the damage that is happening when it comes to synthetic identity fraud. They claim to already be up to £300 million a year, but it is something that is clearly working and as such escalating, both in terms of financial costs and financial impact, but also sort of the erosion of trust and how do we deal with this where we can't really believe what we see and hear anymore. This is one of the most famous cases, so I'm quite confident you're all familiar with. This happened last year. Significant financial damage, but I would say it's also sort of the example where people said, okay, it's really happening. Because of course, anybody in the field of cybersecurity remotely interested in this had already anticipated that deepfakes would be abused. But here it really happened. It was in this case CFO, but obviously CAO type like fraud. So using and you'll see this in the subsequent examples as well, and this is what I mean, they do not disobey their roots, using the traditional tactics of, giving people a sense of urgency, something has to happen now, making a situation where the potential victim does something that is out of the ordinary. It's not rationally what someone would do. This also happened in this case, and I wanted this example in the presentation because it shows sort of, the spectrum of things that can happen. This is a much more personal example. Here someone was phoned in the middle of the night, supposedly by his mother, who had been taken hostage. And of course it wasn't his mother, but if you're called in the middle of the night, you're already sort of, a bit disoriented. Then it's your mother's voice, because obviously her voice was cloned. So are you then in a position to detect it's not your mother? Are you going to question that? So this person ultimately transferred the money, believing it was his mother, but of course it was a scammer. And then, of course, like I said, the romance scams, the pig butchering, investment scams, they all hopped on the train. And the thing is that they can do the real-time deepfake scams. And what's interesting here is they specifically mentioned the Yahoo boys, who've, of course, been around, well, not forever, but for a very long time when it comes to cybercrime. So they simply adapted to the evolution and the capabilities of emerging technologies. Then there is the case of North Korea, which has been using the opportunities offered by Gen AI extensively. KnowBe4 elaborated very much on their case in order to help others, to show what had happened. So you might think that they just did one-off interview and got, misled. But no, there were multiple interviews. The appearance on the video matched the photo. There were background checks. But this person was using a stolen identity. So how can you possibly detect that it's not that person? And also the application photo had been enhanced. So they indeed hired a North Korean IT worker, shipped the materials because this was going to be a remote colleague, and immediately started downloading malware onto the machine, and that's how they discovered it. But they're not by themselves. It's just that they were very elaborate about how it happened to them. I mean, it is ongoing. It continues. And what is interesting is the agencies had already detected it a few years ago. So this is guidance from 2022, 2023, 2024. They started with charges and seizures. And this is sort of the FBI list in terms of searching for the actual suspects who managed to get there. So what's interesting, of course, is you think North Korea, it's not necessarily, well, it's a combination, I would say, of geopolitics and money. Because of the sanctions, obviously, North Korea often acts like a criminal, so they are also doing it to gain money, but at the same time, also an interesting geopolitical angle. Now, this person, this is obviously where we get into the area of they abuse celebrities or, famous people, politicians, etc. This guy has his own podcast and was basically, they managed to imitate him. His name is Scott Melker, have a deepfake impersonation, and then convince people to invest significant amounts to the point that someone, because it says here the loss was 4 million. In fact, if we are to believe the reporting, it was also just one person investing the 4 million and then others, of course, investing smaller amounts. But what you really saw is they tried to sort of create a holistic, believable story. So they also faked things from his family. So it was video, it was voice, it was other credential information. And that's when you really almost get into what this article calls identity hijacking, that you have so many different components that the believability is extremely high. And that we weren't able to do in the past to that extent. So obviously, a wide range of examples where the technology is being abused in order to enhance existing scams and existing forms of identity fraud. What is our response? Well, the first response is most often to immediately go for the technology, fight technology with technology. And this is also interesting because if you look back, in 2018, the US Department of Defense was already looking into how can we use technology to detect deepfakes. And this is obviously ongoing. Many other companies are doing it. But there's other people saying, well, technology isn't going to solve this problem. We're not able to actually say this is like a solution because if we develop technology to detect deepfakes, criminals will just one-up you and overcome that and create better deepfakes or better voice clones. What's interesting, though, is that it might not be the solution, but I don't think anything is the solution, but it can be part of the package, and I don't think we should discredit it. Because if we look at the way criminals work, obviously they will test things. They won't go full-blown out. They'll test things. If you look at those sort of attempts, if you manage to detect the attempts, you're already one step ahead, because then you can sort of know they're trying something and anticipate what they're going to do next. And if you do this sort of I would say for a sector, it can be very helpful. And the reason I say for a sector is because I've worked with Dutch banks. I used to work for the Dutch Banking Association. And when we would have our discussions with the different banks, it's one bank would notice something, so the others would know that the same attempts would be made. So you can sort of already anticipate and then think, okay, how can we respond to this? And I think in the end, much of sort of the internet banking fraud we experienced, I would say about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we managed to cope with from a financial services perspective by detecting and monitoring and seeing these patterns and then subsequently responding to them. But there's another thing, because there's this claim of like, well, we fight it with technology, but they'll just improve the technology. But this is an interesting perspective that I think deserves some reflection and thought, where it's this hill climbing. So the hill climbing is that criminals will continuously improve. But if you already have a very realistic deepfake, and it's working well, and it is being rejected, how much room for improvement is there? And I think this is worth considering. I don't have an answer, but is it really feasible that they can continue to improve, or will they reach a ceiling eventually? And if the ceiling is identified, could that be part, at least, of the solution? Then, of course, there's policy. Also not the answer. There's different types of requests for policy. For example, Microsoft requesting to outlaw AI-generated deepfake fraud. There is in Denmark an attempt to say, we include it as part of copyright law. So if someone uses your voice, if someone uses your image, you have legal standing under copyright law. I'm not really sure what that will get you, because to actually fight it in court, I think, is quite extensive. It might be helpful to you in terms of identity fraud cases. And this is just, I don't expect you to read all this, but it's just to give an impression in terms of different proposals going around in the world. Many of them are focused on sort of sexual related deepfakes, deepfake pornography, etc. It's very much about providers having to label the content and saying, this is AI generated, or this is, again, it's not going to be bulletproof, because if that means people will think, oh, it doesn't have a label, so it must be authentic, I think that is a problem, because then they will assume authenticity. If it isn't authentic, okay, the provider might be told afterwards, but you've already caused damage. What's interesting, there's always this claim of policymakers running after the fact. But this isn't necessary, because obviously 4 years ago in this research report, and this is just one example, there was already a focus on what can we do within European policy. And the other thing is, and that's why I said that all the way in the beginning, criminals don't disobey their roots. So we have the capacity to anticipate what they're going to do if we're willing to listen. But I think a lot of times, also having worked with policy workers, I'm a little skeptical in terms of to what extent do they want to tackle the difficult question, because I realize they might not have an answer. Then there's public awareness. I am not opposed to public awareness. I don't think awareness necessarily equals ability. I'll get to that in a moment. But the other thing is, yes, we can inform the public that there are these possibilities of deepfakes, of voice cloning. So we can sort of educate and train people to be critical, to not assume authenticity, but to really say, you should be able to detect this with your naked eye or with your naked ear, I think is assuming too much, and I think is also a bit unreasonable and unfair. And there have been various studies in terms of to what extent can people actually detect it. There was also one, this was last year, in terms of like with voice, can you actually detect it's a clone? Like I said a few minutes ago, or a minute ago, I think, and this is an article I wrote 13 years ago, but I think there is a significant distance between awareness and ability. I think if you make someone aware, it doesn't make them able. And I think this is a very important distinction, that we shouldn't lose in terms of our considerations. So yes, people might be aware, but they might not be able to detect it. And I think there is a risk of saying we've made people aware, so we're no longer liable for anything that happens. Then there's this idea, obviously, of a zero trust mindset. I know zero trust is a bit of a popular term, but what I simply mean by it is this idea of maybe we should take that extra step not to immediately assume something is true. So I'm not saying we should assume everything is inauthentic. I think that has a problem of its own, but it should be in the back of our mind. And what's interesting is here is for an example where someone did manage to catch an attempt at a deepfake scam with Ferrari. So asking someone that you need this person to identify themselves, or asking an out-of-band question, or doing something out of the ordinary to test the situation. The interesting thing is this is very uncomfortable, of course. It's a bit like the situation when you're in the office. We recently even had this discussion with colleagues, because now externals cannot enter our floor anymore. But we have colleagues, of course, who forget their badge, so they cannot get in, so they sort of come in behind you. And recently someone actually asked someone like, oh, I don't recognize you. Are you a new colleague? And the person simply said yes. And so we had this discussion and we said, well, maybe next time you can ask the department. But the thing is, we don't know everyone in every department. So how do you sort of cope with that? Because do you stand there and not let the person in? So all these social situations, they are complicated. And I think when it comes to these type of scams, a lot of times it's a higher official. And if you challenge a higher official, it's uncomfortable and it might even have implications for you. But criminals take advantage of this. So in general, yeah, being, I would almost say, a bit paranoid or distrustful might be advantageous, but socially unacceptable and therefore complicated. But that seems to be, at least from a public perspective, the way to go, sort of asking extra questions. This is a suggestion, for example, where you would, to avoid the situation where it's potentially your mother calling or another family member, you would sort of create a physical password. Again, not bulletproof, but the idea is that you would only share it in person, and then if someone calls and you don't trust the situation, that you can ask them. In this scenario, it's also very possible that criminals catch on to this. Like I said, nothing is bulletproof. It's something we have to sort of cope with when we look at the future. So I think one of the most difficult questions we must address looking forward is really sort of how do we prove who we are in the future? Because in a way, I would say we're running out of options. In the past, it was always this combination of authentication, something we know, something we are, something we have. But now that all of them are in theory vulnerable, it sort of puts us on very loose and fragile ground. So I don't have an answer to this, but I would love to sort of think about it and deliberate it and leave you with that. So thank you very much for your attention. There is about 55 seconds in case anybody has a question.
Anybody want to ask a question? Here we go.
Hello? Yeah. I'm interested that you say that some cybercrime can be front-run by looking for the indicators of fraud as they're testing out the smaller cases. But how can you do that, especially in privacy-focused environments, without wide swath surveillance? Or can you?
Well, I would say, I mean, of course, it depends on what type of organization you run. But there's already sort of, like if I look at banks, for example, there is already a lot of detection going on. So I would say this is all in a way theoretical, of course, but if you see something out of the ordinary and you sort of capture a number of cases, why would you not be able to analyze them? The question, of course, is what type of information do you use? But I think they're already at a level where it could fall under all of the monitoring detection that's already happening. And that has, I think, been socially accepted, at least in the Netherlands. I mean, all transactions are being monitored.
So you'd say it'd be focused more at the organizational level and not at the governmental level?
I was mostly thinking of organizational, yeah. Okay. Like private organizations.
Do I throw this back at you, or?
Not too hard, but yes. Can we then get a big round of applause for Nicole van der Meulen?